And the reason why I want to have a conversation in regards to federal education is I do believe there's a kind of a misguided idea on the role of the Department of Education in America. My last podcast episode, I broke down pretty intricately that when it comes to each state, the best states when it comes to quality of education, quality of staff, safety of students, and student success, those heavily lean Democrat states. Like there's not a average where it's equal. No, the 10 best states, or more specifically, 9 out of the 10 best states when it comes to public education are Democrat. 9 of the 10 worst states when it comes to public education are Republican. So I looked that up, I found this information, and I noted it. I told the people what the truth is. And after some feedback and after some kind of disagreement with facts, which is kind of wild, I was told that, well, it's still the Department of Education's fault that these Republican states are doing so poorly. So, my next step of action is to find out exactly what does the Department of Education do? What role does it play in terms of education throughout the United States of America? And I looked it up, I tried to find out what the responsibilities are, and this is what I found out. So there are main responsibilities for the Department of Education. Not speaking on any potential policies that may have taken place, but their role, what they do, and everything that they have done up until now can obviously have further conversation, but their main responsibilities in regards to education across America is far different than the expectation that people have. First things first is that they establish federal financial aid policies. I think that is pretty easy to understand. Financial aid is a big contributor on people going to school and higher education. For me, I definitely benefited it because I did not have the money to pay for it, regardless of how much scholarship money I got. So financial aid, unless you disagree with financial aid, I feel like we can all agree that that is a viable thing that the Department of Education should do. And getting rid of the Department of Education will obviously have to reroute how you do financial aid, which will be very interesting. They also monitor fund usage. So this is how much funds the federal government gives out to states to fund the schools. Now, I can tell you exactly how it works, but the better way to do it is to show you. So I will show you in a minute exactly how much funding as of 2023, this is where this chart is made, how much funding is given to each individual state. So here's the chart right here. This is the public education funding per K to 12 student from most to least federal funding. So this is funding per student. And I'm going to make a very obvious distinction that I think is also very important as well. So when it comes to federal funding, you have states like Alaska getting $4,000 per student, places like Wyoming getting $2,000, California getting $2,000, North Carolina getting $2,000, New York getting $2,000. For the most part, a lot of the funding pretty relative. Some states get a lot, Alaska gets a lot, but this is also probably because they don't have a large population, I'm guessing. And other places don't get as much, but there's really not big gaps between the funding when you come to state. The lowest is Utah, and the most is Alaska. Everything else is between $1,500 and $2,800 per student per state. And I notice what exactly determines it. I'm guessing it's a variety of different factors. But if you go through each of these states, New York is a Democrat state. Very, very well. It does very well when it comes to public education. And it only gets $2,400. Ohio gets around the same amount of money, but Ohio is far worse when it comes to public education. Then you got states like Mississippi. They do terrible in public education, and they get more money. Again, another Republican state, same with Montana. So I've heard the point that more funding is leading these states to do worse. But these states that are getting more funding and are not doing well are Republican. So I'm very confused how blame is being put on the Department of Education for that. That's the state's fault for not using their funds properly. And a more important point in regards to funding is that only about 10 to 20% of funding for public education, state by state, is from the federal government. Almost 80% of the funding is state, local, or private organizations in the state. So most of the funding is from your local area, which is why you see a state like Alaska, $4,000 per student, but $16,000 per student from their state and local funding. You see a state like West Virginia, $2,000 or $3,000 per student from the federal government, $13,000 per student from the state and local government. You see a state like Vermont, $2,800 from federal government, $24,000 from their state and local. So most of the funding that goes to these areas are from state and local government. So blaming the federal government for funding allocation is misleading, and it doesn't tell the full picture. If anything, if you really want to tell a bigger picture, you should blame your states for the funding that they give, because they give most of the funding. And there's no gap between the funding that the federal government gives state to state. It's relatively the same across the board. But all right, we got that out of the way. When it comes to funding, when it comes to funding for states, the states are funded mostly from their own state government. Around 80% of the state funding is from their state itself. So blaming the Department of Education makes no sense. Now, another thing the Department of Education oversees is research. Obviously, pays attention to what the students are doing on a national level, identifying key educational issues that may be taking place in America, and ensuring equal access of education throughout the country. Also very fair things that the federal government should be doing. Another thing is that they enforce anti-discrimination statutes. They make sure you guys are not racist, sexist, and everything in between. Also another fair thing the Department of Education does. But you know something that the federal education does not do to states? They do not decide curriculum. There is no national standard for education curriculum in America. Curriculum is decided state by state. So what is being taught and how it's being taught in schools are decided from your state government, from your local government. So after compiling all the information, getting all the evidence, and getting the full picture of the role of the Department of Education, here is my conclusion. That when it comes down to it, the fault of poor public education is the fault of the states and the people in the local area. And the reason why Republican states are doing so terribly in public education compared to Democrat states is not the fault of the Department of Education, it's the default of your state government and your local government. The officials you chosen in the state you live in is the fault of your poor education. And this is not an opinion. This is just a fact. I want every state in America to have education on equal footing. But if we turn back the block and make it full 100% state autonomy in terms of deciding education, the states that are Republican are only going to get worse. There is no actual plan for them to get better. What are you going to tell me? You're going to change the curriculum? Then do it. There's no national curriculum standard. What are you going to tell me? You're going to give more funding? Then do it. Most of the funding is based on states. So the discrepancy between Democrat states who have way better public education than Republican states is going to grow. And the divide in terms of education for Democrats and Republicans is also going to grow. This is actually not a good thing. There's no unilateral kind of what's the word? Not I'm forgetting what the word I want to say, or I don't have the word in mind. But there's no cohesion. We're just dividing ourselves more if we go with this idea that we don't need any federal standards, we don't need any the federal government to oversee education. It's gonna make things worse, and I'm just telling you how it is. So we will see. I'm still skeptical of whether or not Donald Trump is really going to get rid of the Department of Education, but we'll see how everything takes place. But these are just the facts, and these are just the truth. And if you want to look up any of the stuff for yourself, I'm making a concerted effort moving forward to put all my sources in the description of the podcast episode. So if you watch or listen to my full podcast episode, all the links will be in the description. I'm trying my hardest to make sure I'm including all the links so all of you guys can look it up yourself. I'm not hiding anything.